All right, intro to Shakespeare. So, the biggest problem I think with Shakespeare is that his plays are taught like stories. The prince is depressed and decides to go on a mission of revenge. Here, I'm going to try to draw this book. After seeing a ghost, but he can never make his mind up about stuff. And then he has this kind of weird relationship with his mom. He accidentally kills his girlfriend's dad, and then her brother challenges him to a duel. Some gravediggers show up. Alas, poor Yorick. Yada yada yada. Everyone dies. The end. Even if you haven't read Hamlet, well, there you go. That's Hamlet. You probably vaguely know this story. But if I tell you that same story again in slightly more detail, with more character development, a few more plot twists and surprise ending, you would still only be getting about 20% of what Shakespeare was really trying to say about his play Hamlet. Why? Because the problem with Shakespeare is that everyone treats his plays like stories, when there's so much more than just plain old stories. And I'm going to try to explain why in this introduction to Shakespeare. The form of entertainment that we call the play has actually existed for a really long time, much longer than any other form of entertainment that we have today and that we're very familiar with. And that's a major understatement. Think about TV. I'm going to try to draw a timeline here. TV's been around for, this is rough, not to scale. TV's been around for like 60 years. Radio's been around for 100, but about 100. But plays in their traditional theatrical form, they've been around for about 2,500 years. This is going way back to the Greeks, and that's a really long time. And don't get me wrong, Shakespeare was a great storyteller, it's true. He was keenly aware of this very long, very rich history of stories, and he drew extensively from all these ancient texts, which were actually very available in Elizabethan times. So this is Shakespeare. He's kicking around late 1500s. And Shakespeare clearly had access to all kinds of original Greek and Latin texts from Plutarch, for example, and Ovid. They're over here. Homer and his Iliad would have been familiar to Shakespeare. There's a bunch of old Roman guys that Shakespeare drew from, if you can believe it, like the writer Plautus. He was kicking around way back in 200 BC. Actually, Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors is a blatant ripoff of a couple of Plautus plays. That sounds funny, Plautus plays. And the Bible, of course, here, of course, figures heavily in his work as well. But like I said, for these types of stories to last, they got to be way more than just a story. For 2,500 years for stuff to last, you got to have some substance. There's got to be other stuff working for you. You're probably thinking, well, like what? Like special effects and CGI and explosions? Oh, I'm actually talking about stuff that's even better than that. It turns out these types of special effects, I guess you could call them, have existed for over 2,500 years, and they have existed in our language. Oh yeah, you heard it right, language. Specifically, special effects are hidden in a linguistic concept called discrete infinity, which is a concept made famous by someone named Noam Chomsky. Maybe you've heard of him. He's a very famous linguist / cognitive scientist. He's also a really interesting guy. To understand Shakespeare, you have to first understand the concept of discrete infinity, which is a totally crazy property, or you'd call it a feature of language, and it's kind of a self-referential property. It refers to itself in these strange kind of looping ways, which makes it even more weird, but I can explain. First of all, discrete infinity, it's a kind of oxymoron. An oxymoron is a figure of speech. It's actually our first figure of speech. We'll go through a whole bunch of different figures of speech that Shakespeare uses in his plays. But oxymoron is one of them. So what's an oxymoron? It's a figure of speech that combines two seemingly contradictory elements. So think of expressions that refer to two things that are opposites, two things that, when you put them together, they don't really make much sense. For example, awfully good. You know when something is so good it's awful. It's not just good. The word on its own doesn't really work. It's stronger than just good. It's awfully good. Two completely different words combined, awful and good. Or think of something that's bittersweet. Bittersweet refers to the feeling of both pleasure and happiness, like the sweetness part. And then at the same time, it's kind of sad. There's a little bit of regret in there and unhappiness, which is the bitter part. You know, an example could be if you're moving out of your house to go to university. You're leaving your friends, you're leaving your family, your loved ones, so it's sad, it's bitter. But you're moving on in life and you're going on these new adventures, so it's sweet and you're excited and it's happy. And it's this combination of good and bad, which is invested into this word, this concept that we call bittersweet. So that's an example of an oxymoron. The concept of discrete infinity is an oxymoron because it's made up of two opposite ideas. So let's break them down. There's the word discrete, which means distinct, individual, like this chair has 4 discrete legs, has 4 distinct legs. And then there's the word infinity, which is the quality or state of being infinite, which means boundless, endless. You know, it's a number that's too great to be measurable. And when we use these two terms together, the term discrete infinity refers to the boundless creative properties of language. Basically, it means that our language is made up of a limited finite set of individually separate and distinct elements. So think of things like letters, words, and sentences, which are combined to produce an infinite variety of expressions, an infinite amount of thoughts, imaginations, feelings, all that stuff that's evoked, that's hard to put into words, but that are real because you and I, we can feel them. So the elements of language are discrete. You can think of it like there's no such thing as a third of a word or like 1.2 words. That would have no meaning to us. Or think about letters in the alphabet. There's only 26 letters in the alphabet. Words are not, and letters and words and sentences are not divisible or multipliable. There's a finite number of them. But when you string these words and sentences and letters together, you get this huge range of nuances of expression, this huge range of feelings and thoughts that are produced in our minds, which are actually infinite. Now compare that to the special effects of your TV's definition. You know, it's limited to what, 1080p or 60 frames per second or 32-bit color depth. Our sight's very limited. Our sense of smell is terrible compared to some other animals. Even our hearing's not very good, but our mind's ability to comprehend language, very, very special. This property of language is, this infinite property of language, by the way, it doesn't exist anywhere else in the biological world. And scientists and linguists believe that the only thing that comes close to language's crazy properties is our arithmetical capacity, which is a fancy term for our ability to do math, our computational capabilities, which could well be, a lot of scientists think, just an offshoot of our original language faculty, which is amazing. So this is where Shakespeare comes in. Shakespeare was an absolute master of language's property of discrete infinity. He was an absolute master of it. He recognizes that language is very limited, it's very impoverished, and at the same time, he's incredibly clever and creative with the ways that he surfaces these great emotions of infinite proportions in millions of people who read his plays and who experience his plays in person. And so this is what I'm going to try to get across in these talks. This all probably sounds kind of intimidating, big words, large concepts, but keep in mind that it's actually not. Remember, Shakespeare's audience in Elizabethan England was very illiterate. Nobody could read or write. And also remember that the stages where his plays were held, the sets, the costumes, they were very sparse, very bare. So his audience and fans were really dependent on his special verbal effects, the strange and wonderful powers of language to evoke magic inside people's minds. It's a beautiful thing, trust me. And so, with a little guidance from me, you too will be able to feel and understand this huge, vaulting, soaring imagination of just Shakespeare's genius and the deep pleasures that come from tapping into the strange and wonderful world of language and imagination and beauty. All right, here we go. Thanks for listening. Onwards to the plays.